COVID-19, the whole thing was premeditated. It was murder. It was active terrorism. And let's not pretend like maybe there's a more complex explanation for, I don't know, the facts. And the facts are, for 58 years, the United States, the UK, in collaboration with researchers around the world, planned to use coronavirus to instill the most tyrannical reform of society that this generation has ever seen.
It's just incredible when you start going through the dates.
Throughout the 70s, going into the early 80s, what they found was that this crazy thing that they had labeled coronavirus was engineerable to all sorts of specification. And what's important about the vaccine that Pfizer patented in 1990, so when I hear somebody come along and tell me that they had Operation Warp Speed, that only took 30 years of failed trial after failed trial, which included as recently a series of publications that said coronavirus and the vaccine concept cannot coexist.
It's so hard to believe that they left such a blatant paper trail.
You know, we've spent the last 3 years going, no, they couldn't have really planned this, right? We wouldn't have governments in collusion with this. We wouldn't have like China in on it too, would we? Well, the answer is yeah, all of them were in on it.
You finished that speech in the EU with some strong statements. Nature was hijacked.
Science was hijacked.
Morality was suspended.
No more gain-of-function research.
No more weaponization of nature.
No more corporate patronage of science.
Unless they assume 100% product liability.
For every injury and every death that they maintain. Thank you very much. The audacity of the crime paralyzes us to go, holy shit, we are actually now living in a world where we know that 8 to 9 million people were murdered by the Allied governments. Murdered. And we're fine with that.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. David Martin, the American author, professor, and researcher. You are the founder and CEO of MCAM, which provides research and advice to over 160 countries regarding finance, patents, and trades. You were the central figure in the documentary film Plandemic 2, which we live streamed here on our Digital Freedom platform to over 2 million viewers, the largest live broadcast of a documentary film in history. In the movie, you expose the elaborate web of deception and lies by governments, corporations, and regulators that caused the COVID-19 pandemic. And you also appear in the latest installment, Plandemic 3, The Great Awakening. Ultimately, you believe COVID was a pre-planned act of biological and chemical warfare perpetrated on the human race. And you said exactly that in the European Parliament during the recent International COVID Summit in Brussels. David, welcome back to London Real.
I am so happy to see you, Brian. It's great to be here. And man, what a beautiful suit you've got on.
Well, that's
some great things never change.
Well, that's a beautiful tie. And the man that consistently pulls off the bow tie is a strong man indeed. We'll definitely get you over to London and we'll go down to Savile Row and maybe you can teach me a thing or two. How's that?
There you go.
David, I couldn't be more excited to speak to you. I just uploaded a 20-minute piece of you speaking in front of the EU, and I highly recommend everybody go watch that when we're finished. I think it's probably the single most important, most prescient, most potent description of the entire pandemic. And you break down everything that you've been talking about for 20 plus years, and you take us all the way back to 1965 when this whole thing started. And I had a couple flashbacks back to Plandemic 2, but you didn't go all the way into it in Plandemic 2 because it was probably so much information and it was early days. But what you said recently in front of the EU, along with the emotional content, for me, it's the most powerful thing I've seen in years. And I was curious, how would you describe, what you said? Because I think the average person watching us right now has no idea of the detail that you can break down as far as the traces of what happened to us the last few years.
Brian, a lot of people have asked how I do research. And in the case of not only the coronavirus situation, but in the case of anthrax and in the case of conotoxin, in the case of an enormous number of other things, including the Ebola campaign during the mid-2010s, the difference between what a lot of people do and what I do is I watch the thing as it unfolds. You made reference in the opening to the fact that we advise 168 countries. What I receive inside of our corporate structure is the innovation disclosures, contracts, records of procurement, all kinds of things. And that goes into the Cuisinart of our data. It's how we make our global equity indexes that are traded. It's how we do our business. And so we don't look for things. We actually have a system that flags things. I can set flags for all sorts of things. I can set flags for violations of laws. I can set flags for all sorts of either themes or content or actors or whatever. And in the early 2000s, and a lot of people don't know this, but in the early 2000s, when we were asked to look into the anthrax outbreak, which most people don't even remember. I mean, when we talk about September 2001, everybody thinks about planes and towers. But the global fear in September of 2001 and the thing that was exploited to pass what ultimately became the PrEP Act in 2005 was the anthrax outbreak that allegedly happened at the end of the month. And because of the cognitive dissonance of did planes really fly into towers, people forget that the real terrorist attack was actually anthrax. And the problem about forgetting that is people also forget that several years after the alleged investigation, we were able to definitively and unequivocally and without censorship say the United States Department of Defense attacked America. There you go. It's not hard. And the problem, right, is by the time that statement was made, kind of like UFOs are real, gender isn't real, all of the crazy other things that people say, the problem is by the time you get to the conversation where people admit, oh my gosh, the U.S. really did anthrax to itself, people have forgotten the story. And so in many respects, COVID is amnesia 2.0. That's how we should describe it, because this was another U.S. did it to itself, right? And the Wall Street Journal just this past week, and this part cracked me up, through this.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.